let's talk a little bit about the Appalachian African American Cultural Center and how that came to be and the challenges that you both overcome building it from the ground up over the years.
Sure. The Culture Center is the former little one-room school that my great-great-grandmother, Rachel Scott, saw the need that the Black children needed a better building to attend. The school was built in 1939. My mom was the first group in that building in 1939, and I was the last group in 1965 when we integrated. I like to tell stories about our teacher. We had one teacher that taught 7 different grades, actually 8 different grades, starting at primer up to the 7th grade. And it served as the only source of education for the Black children here in the Pennington area. I tell stories about we didn't have playground equipment. Our parents would take old socks and roll them up into balls and sew them into balls. And we would take broom handles and mop handles and play softball out in the yard. But one thing that comes to my mind is that we used to walk by the white school, which was the Pennington Elementary School, at the bottom of the hill where we lived to get to the little one-room school. And we would always see the white children out there playing on the playground equipment, and we wondered, well, why can't we have the same thing? We didn't have a cafeteria. It was just a little one-room school. Our parents would make us a brown bag every morning, a sandwich, apple, or an orange, and they would give us a nickel. And the nickel was for the milk. We had a milkman that came every morning around 9:30, and the white milk was 2 cents, and the chocolate milk was 3 cents. And we would drink our white milk with our lunch every day, and then our chocolate milk would be in the afternoon recess. We didn't have a high school here at the time, so when you finished the 7th grade, there was a little bitty bus that took the older kids up to Big Stone Gap to Bland High School. Bland was the closest Black high school in the area at the time. So the first 7 years of my education was out this little one-room school building that is the Appalachian African American Cultural Center today. And it always had a special place in my heart. And when I moved away, now, if you think about it, when I moved away, there was still some segregation going on in the higher education institutions in this area. So I really couldn't get into a decent school. So I went to Boston, where I had an aunt living. And I stayed in Boston for the next, I guess, 18 to 20 years, and where I met my wife, Jill. And we decided that we wanted to come back to Southwest Virginia in the mid-'80s. And ironically, when we came back, the Lee County school system was beginning to consolidate schools. They were building a new high school, Lee High School. So the little one-room school that I attended all those years, after integration, it became a Head Start center, and for many, many, many years. Now, my great-great-grandmother built the building, but the Lee County school system actually took over the building after integration. So we found out when we moved here in 1986, during the school consolidation and the building of the Lee High School, is that the little one-room school was going to be torn down, or it was going to be sold to the highest bidder. All around this little one-room school, you know, we own the property. Right across where the school is where we built our home. And to the left and right, we have, other lots that belong to the family. So this little one-room school was sitting right in the middle of our property. So make a long story short, there was a lot of battles that we had to do to retain the school. And I will let Jill talk a little bit about the battles, because I found them to be emotionally draining when I talk about them. So Jill, you can tell them about the battles that we had in retaining the school.
Well, as Ron mentioned, the school building obviously meant a lot to him, to his family members, and to other young Black folks that went to school there. And every time that Ron brought me here before we moved, when we came to visit, he would bring me to this building and he would reminisce about the building, how important it was. And the other people did the same thing. So when the school system started dragging their feet about, what they were going to do with the building, the overall status. And let me mention that the reason why the ownership, if you will, rested in their hands was because there was no reversion clause in the deed that said once this building stopped operating as a school, then it would revert back to the family. So that presented the problem. So they had no intention of turning that building over. I contacted the nearest chapter of NAACP, told them about the plight, and that chapter happened to be in Bristol, Virginia, told them about our plight, and they met with us and were more than willing to work with us. And as Ron said, it was not an easy thing for us to go through. We had to take it to court. We had to ultimately just shame them into turning the building back over to the community. And when they did that, they just agreed to turning the building back but without the property, which she said, explained belonged to his great-great-grandmother as well. So there were actually two battles that we had to go through for both the building as well as the property. When we ultimately got the building, we didn't know what we wanted to do with it. So we were fortunate, Ron and I were fortunate enough to get a fellowship to the Highlander Research and Education Center located in Newmarket, Tennessee. And it was actually the Southern Appalachian Leadership Training Program that we were fortunate enough to participate in. And it was through that experience that we got the idea of turning it into what it is today, the Appalachian African American Cultural Center. But it was because we learned there that very little, if anything, had ever been written about the experience of African Americans in the Central Appalachian region.
Pretty much the coalfield counties of Southwest Virginia and Eastern Kentucky, Southern West Virginia, and parts of Northeast Tennessee. Very little has been written, so that sparked our interest. I can remember going to a Black History program during Black History Month in February up at the old Clinch Valley College, which is now University of Virginia College of Wise. And I saw a quote by Dr. Carter G. Woodson. And that quote has just resonated in my head for all these years. And I'm gonna paraphrase him. He said, perhaps the most important element to any given people is the documentation and preservation of their history. If a race has no history, it has no worthwhile tradition, and it stands to be lost in the eyes of society forever. So seeing that and not really knowing the history of Lee County, Wise County, Scott County, Dickinson County, Russell County, Tazewell County, it just gave me the incentive to try to learn more about this particular region. But as we started to reaching out to these different counties, No, we saw the interest, like I said, in southern West Virginia, that borders Southwest Virginia. The same in Eastern Kentucky, Harlan, Lynch, Benham. So it was pretty much the same experience all around. And one thing I do want to mention is that, you know, we are not a museum, and we have never been a museum. We do have some memorabilia, some artifacts in the building, but we are a education and research center where we document stories of African Americans throughout this area and region.
And one thing that we didn't mention, Charles, is the demographics of this area. I think it's important for people to understand. Back in 1986, when we came to live here, the population, overall population for Lee County was around 25,000 in the county. And of that, less than 1% Blacks. And it remains that way, if not fewer. If one were to look online or check the census, those numbers would look very different. And that is because we have a federal penitentiary here, and those numbers are also, they kind of skew the, you know, the actual numbers, because that's based on area code. Zip code, I'm sorry. So anyway, we came back from Highlander and met with community. And when we talk about community, we will always be talking about the majority, the basically white community, because there are so few Blacks here. And we had a meeting and at Ron's parents' house and talked about this idea of documenting and preserving the history here at the center. Everybody, you know, supported it, loved the idea. So we hit the ground running, because the Black community was an elderly community and we wanted to get the stories while we could. We wanted to make that happen. There was a time, during the time that people carried those big video cameras on their shoulders, and we got everybody that was interested to get out and help us get the stories, and community support was wonderful, was wonderful. So that's how it all began, and we started getting the stories. We got started gathering memorabilia. We worked with, for those who are familiar with the folks from the Apple Shop in Whitesburg, Kentucky, they trained us on how to facilitate story swaps, another means, another avenue of getting the stories. The first event that we had, story swap, was on one-room schools. People came from everywhere, because everybody wanted to talk about their one-room schools, Black or white, they wanted to talk. So we got those stories and got them documented. We had a woman, 96-year-old woman, who wanted to facilitate a session on remedies and herbs from the mountains, and she did that. So we got that documented. Then we went to holiday traditions in the mountains. So it just started growing and growing to the point where we weren't able to hold those events at the center because we couldn't accommodate the numbers of people. And we just continued to do that. And then in 1993, we had a fire. And unfortunately, we lost everything in that fire. And one of the things, I say everything, but there was one thing that did survive the fire, and that was, and if you could see it today, that was the program, if you will, from Rachel Scott's funeral. And it's singed at the bottom. You can see the singe.
And the lock of her
and
hair.
a lock of her hair, because back there was very common to do that. When someone died, you kept a lock of their hair, and it survived the fire. So that really gave us the impetus to start all over again.